Welcome to this 114th episode of the Book of Mormon Digging Deeper podcast. We're going to step away from the Doctrine and Covenants for the next 2 weeks and explore the Joseph Smith history as found in the Pearl of Great Price. This account should give us a better perspective on the development of the early church and help us understand better how and why the Doctrine and Covenants came about. Today, we're taking a deeper look into the first vision of the prophet Joseph Smith and the events that led up to that holy experience. I wonder why the world was so quick to jump on young Joseph Smith in 1820. He thought he had had an extraordinary experience, and he chose to share that experience with a Methodist minister. And one would think that a pious man of God, listening to the tale of a young boy, would, at the very least, listen and show kindness to the lad, even if he thought the boy was delusional. Kids tell tales and make up stories all the time, and so many times they're very sincere about it. They may be wrong, but most adults realize this and try to placate them as best they can. But when 14-year-old Joseph Smith Jr. told his minister he thought he saw God, he was met with anything but understanding and kindness. His life was, from that moment on, in peril. Well, here, let's start from the beginning. Joseph Smith was born in Sharon, Vermont on the 23rd of December in 1805. His family were primarily farmers. His father, Joseph Smith Sr., moved the family to Palmyra, New York in or about 1814, and they resided there for the next 4 years, after which they moved to Manchester Township, just a few miles south of Palmyra. This history that we have is one of several that either Joseph wrote or that were written for him and with his cooperation. The first version of the vision was written in 1832, that's 12 years after it happened, and then another in 1835. The latest one was in 1842, but the version we get in the Pearl of Great Price was written in 1838, fully 8 years after the church was formed. It is generally accepted as the one best suited for general public dissemination, and Joseph explains in the first verse why he wrote this version. He says, "Owing to the many reports which have been circulated by evil-disposed and designing persons in relation to the rise and progress of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, all of which have been designed by the authors thereof to militate against its character as a church and its progress in the world, I have been induced to write this history, to disabuse the public mind, and to put all inquirers after the truth in possession of the facts, as they have transpired, in relation both to myself and the church, so far as I have such facts in my possession." As a young man, Joseph did not think to write about himself. As I said, the first account of his early life was not put to paper until 1832. Now, there are some variations between the versions of the histories, and this should not be misconstrued, as they were written to different audiences and for different purposes. The content was adapted to the intended listeners, and so he stressed different aspects of his history according to the people and their varying degrees of cordiality to his positions. The story really begins after their move to Manchester, and Joseph said that he encountered what he called, quote, "the unusual excitement on the subject of religion." He stated that it began with the Methodists, but soon became general among all the sects of the country. The excitement seemed to involve all the people of the area, and soon, he says, great multitudes were uniting themselves to one or another of the churches. What bothered young Joseph about the whole thing was that although they all expressed great love for the Lord at the time of their conversion, he says things changed quickly once the people were divided into their respective sects. The record says, "For notwithstanding the great love which the converts to these different faiths expressed at the time of their conversion, and the great zeal manifested by the respective clergy who were active in getting up and promoting this extraordinary scene of religious feeling, in order to have everybody converted, as they were pleased to call it, let them join what sect they pleased, yet when the converts began to file off, some to one party and some to another, it was seen that the seemingly good feelings of both priests and the converts were more pretended than real, for a scene of great confusion and bad feeling ensued. Priest contending against priest, and convert against convert, so that all their good feelings, one for another, if they ever had any, were entirely lost in the strife of words and a contest about opinions." These feelings came to a head with the religious upheaval occurring in and around Palmyra early in 1820, I would suppose as the winter snows were melting and just before spring set in and the men returned to the fields to plant their crops. That would have been the time to hold such revivals, as he called them, on another occasion. As stated, this contention was one of great concern to the young boy. He was tending towards the Methodist, but he says, "But so great were the confusion and strife among the differing denominations that it was impossible for a person young as I was, and so unacquainted with men and things, to come to any certain conclusion who was right and who was wrong. In the midst of this war of words and tumult of opinion, I often said to myself, what is to be done? Who of all the parties are right, or are they all wrong together?" This shows me a remarkable sensitivity to things spiritual and a mature perspective for a boy of between 12 and 15 years old. And that last statement, "or are they all wrong together," was actually a pretty perceptive thought for such a young man. This recognition that all of them could be wrong. Often we say, "Which of you is right?" But to think you could all be wrong is a tougher leap to make. This was a big deal to Joseph. He described the time as, quote, "laboring under extreme difficulty," close quote, which I find interesting. After all, he was a boy, 14 going on 15, and to have religion be the apparent focus of his young life is quite extraordinary. I would think there would be other things on the mind of a 14-year-old boy. His actions showed the nature of this young man and the valiant spirit he possessed. His mind turned to the Bible, and it was while reading the epistle of James that his attention fell to the 5th verse of chapter 1. It said, "If any of you lack wisdom, let him ask of God, who giveth to all men liberally and upbraideth not, and it shall be given him." Joseph said, "Never did any passage of Scripture come with more power to the heart of man than this did at this time to mine." And he said, "I reflected on it again and again." It was this verse that ultimately drove him into the sacred grove to put James's words to the test. He said, "At length I came to the conclusion that I must either remain in darkness and confusion, or else I must do as James directs, that is, ask of God. I at length came to the determination to ask of God, concluding that if he gave wisdom to them that lacked wisdom, and would give liberally and not upbraid, I might venture. So in accordance with this, my determination to ask God, I retired to the woods to make the attempt." This is actually quite amazing. I may be wrong, but I suppose that many of us, being directed scripturally to pray and ask God, would simply have incorporated our request into our regular evening devotions and prayers, as was the tradition in those days, and these, to be true. To actually plan for the event and go into the woods to find the right place beforehand showed real intent and dedication to this effort. He went into the woods and scouted out the place where he would seek the answers to his questions before God. He buried an axe in a stump in a clearing to mark the spot he had chosen. This was obviously a very serious matter for him. When the time came, he says sometime in the early spring, he ventured into the spot he had chosen and began to pray. His account of the event that transpired is remarkable and a bit frightening at first. Here's what he said happened. After I had retired to the place where I had previously designed to go, having looked around me and finding myself alone, I kneeled down and began to offer up the desires of my heart to God. And here's the scary part. I had scarcely done so when immediately I was seized upon by some power which entirely overcame me and had such an astonishing influence over me as to bind my tongue so that I could not speak. Thick darkness gathered around me, and it seemed to me for a time as if I were doomed to sudden destruction. How terrifying would that be to any of us? And for an inexperienced 14-year-old boy, it must have been very frightening. He actually thought he might die. He continues, but exerting all my powers to call upon God to deliver me out of the power of this enemy which had seized upon me. And at the very moment when I was ready to sink into despair and abandon myself to destruction, not to an imaginary ruin, but to the power of some actual being from the unseen world who had such marvelous power as I had never before felt in any being, just at this moment of great alarm, I saw a pillar of light exactly over my head, above the brightness of the sun, which descended gradually until it fell upon me. It no sooner appeared than I found myself delivered from the enemy which bound me. What a scary beginning to this whole experience that must have been. Now, this portion of his experience seems not unlike that of Alma the Younger when he was stopped on the road by the angel and made to see his life in retrospect, causing him to despair and feel as if he were going to be destroyed. Similarly, Lehi's vision of the tree of life and the great and spacious building and the iron rod began with a frightening darkness which enveloped him. I can't speak to the mechanics of these situations, but I can recognize the pattern that apparently must be quite common with some heavenly visions. I guess it must be acknowledgement of that great eternal principle of opposition in all things that grants Satan an equal shot at the men the Lord chooses for his work. This would, after all, be the ultimate expression and exercise of one's free will and moral agency. Now, as we continue, I want you to know that Joseph actually had two things on his mind on this occasion. The one was his feelings of sinfulness and his basic unworthiness, something not mentioned in the 1838 version. And the other, of course, was concerning which church was correct and which he should join. I say this because we're going to read here about the answer to the second question, but no mention will be made in this version of his story about the question and answer to the first. After we have read the verse here in Joseph Smith history, I will share with you what he said in the 1832 version. It actually has bearing on this history. But remember, this version was written in response, he says, owing to the many reports which have been circulated by evil-disposed persons in relation to the rise and progress of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. The 1838 account was a public declaration of his experience as it related to those evil reports. No need to get into his personal struggles as a contributing factor here. That was a more personal issue, and the first version was, I think, more of a personal journal or diary type of account, one more inclusive of his personal feelings and struggles. But continuing here, he says, when the light rested upon me, I saw two personages whose brightness and glory defy all description. standing above me in the air. One of them spake to me, calling me by name, and said, pointing to the other, This is my beloved Son, hear him. In this public account, Joseph states his reason for going into the woods to seek the Lord in the first place. As I said, there's more to the story, but here's what he writes here. My objective in going to inquire of the Lord was to know which of all the sects was right, that I might know which to join. No sooner, therefore, did I get possession of myself, so as to be able to speak, than I asked the personages who stood above me in the light, which of all the sects was right. And then parenthetically he says, For at this time it never entered my heart that they were all wrong, and which I should join. That last parenthetical comment seems to contradict what he said earlier when he said, In the midst of this war of words and tumult of opinion, I often said to myself, What is to be done? Who of all the parties are right, or are they all wrong together? But I don't really think it's a contradiction in his story. Note that he says, For at this time. See, I can imagine him being so overwhelmed by the extraordinary event taking place that he forgot completely any doubts he might have had and was so taken with the appearance of the Father and the Son that he just blurted out his query. The response Joseph got was this. I was answered that I should join none of them, for they were all wrong. And the personage who addressed me said that their creeds were an abomination in his sight, that those professors were all corrupt, that they draw near to me with their lips, but their hearts are far from me. They teach for doctrines the commandments of men, having a form of godliness, but they deny the power thereof. This was a powerful statement from the Lord and very definitive. Joseph certainly had had his question answered, probably far differently than anything he might have expected as he went into the woods that day. He stated that the Lord once more forbade him to join any of the churches, and then he says, And many more things did he say unto me, which I cannot write at this time. I find that interesting, and I'm left to wonder what kinds of things he was told, and just why he can't tell us. But that's between him and the Lord. As the event concludes, Joseph says this, When I came to myself again, I found myself lying on my back, looking up into heaven. When the light had departed, I had no strength. This indicates that this was probably an event that could not have been witnessed by others, nor did it take place in the normal spectrum of visible light. Joseph clearly tells us that he was in some altered state, for he must have been present for the delivery of the message the Lord gave him, and yet he says, When I came to myself again, implying that he was in some sort of an altered state for the event. Now, a number of Book of Mormon and biblical prophets have attested to the fact that they were, quote, carried away in the Spirit. In the case of Nephi, he says he was caught away in the Spirit of the Lord into an exceedingly high mountain. And we have accounts of others being in an altered state as they visited with the Lord or with heavenly beings. In Helaman 5, we read about Lehi and Nephi, the sons of Helaman, and it says there, And it came to pass that he turned him about, and behold, he saw through the cloud of darkness the faces of Nephi and Lehi, and behold, they did shine exceedingly, even as the faces of angels. And he beheld that they did lift their eyes to heaven, and they were in the attitude as if they were talking or lifting their voices to some being whom they beheld. In Daniel, in the Bible, chapter 10, we read, Yet I heard the voice of his words, and when I heard the voice of his words, then was I in a deep sleep on my face, and my face toward the ground. We read of the exhaustion that Father Lehi had after his vision of the Lord in 1 Nephi 1. It says, And it came to pass that he returned to his own house at Jerusalem, and he cast himself upon his bed, being overcome with the Spirit and the things which he had seen. We have another account of Moses from the book of Moses in which he was in the presence of the Lord. It's not made clear if this was the same time that he received the commandments on Mount Sinai, but listen to what it says. the words of God which he spake unto Moses at a time when he was caught up into an exceedingly high mountain. See, again, just like Nephi. And he saw God face to face, and he talked with him, and the glory of God was upon Moses. Therefore, Moses could endure his presence. And we get the account of the things which God told him, and then in verse 9 we read this: And the presence of God withdrew from Moses, that his glory was not upon Moses, and Moses was left unto himself, and as he was left to himself, he fell to the earth. And it came to pass that it was many hours before Moses did again receive his natural strength, like unto a man. And he said unto himself, Now for this cause I know that man is nothing, which thing I never had supposed. But now mine own eyes have beheld God, but not my natural, but my spiritual eyes. For my natural eyes could not have beheld, for I should have withered and died in his presence. But his glory was upon me, and I beheld his face, for I was transfigured before him. And then we also read of Mary, the mother of Jesus, who was carried away by the Spirit, and it says, The Holy Ghost shall come upon thee, and the power of the highest shall overshadow thee. Therefore, that holy thing which shall be born of thee shall be called the Son of God. There are similar accounts throughout the Scripture, each time saying that the Spirit of the Lord had to come over them in order for them to be able to stand in the presence of God. Now, I don't want to belabor the point, maybe I already have, but this account of Joseph Smith is very much in keeping with the scriptural accounts we have in the standard works for all those who come into the presence of the Lord. And like Moses, he too found himself upon the ground when it was all over. He says, When I came to myself again, I found myself lying on my back, looking to heaven. When the light had departed, I had no strength. But soon recovered in some degree, I went home, and as I leaned up to the fireplace, Mother inquired what the matter was. So that's why I say I don't think anyone else who might have been present or spying on him during his visit to the woods would have seen anything beyond the boy talking to some unseen being. Joseph was certainly moved into some extra-dimensional or otherwise condition in which the veil was parted, not to be seen by others not so privileged. I have visited the Joseph Smith home in New York, and I have stood in the bedroom where Moroni appeared by his bed. It is a very small room, and he had two brothers asleep in the beds next to his, as well as two sisters just on the other side of a very flimsy wall. None of them were aware of the angelic visitation of Moroni. And remember, he came 3 times during the night to deliver his message. All of this is to say that Joseph's story was consistent with other scriptural accounts of heavenly visitations. And we'll speak much more of Moroni next week. Now, at this point, I want to talk about Joseph's personal account that was written in 1832. It adds something very interesting and important that he did not include in his 1838 account. I'm taking this from the wonderful book Joseph Smith, Rough Stone Rolling by Richard L. Bushman, which I can't recommend enough. It is a wonderful and very thorough look into the early history of the church and into Joseph Smith the man. It should be on everyone's bookshelf. Anyway, Joseph wrote, From the age of 12 to 15, I pondered many things in my heart concerning the situation of the world of mankind, the contentions and divisions, the wickedness and abominations, and the darkness which pervaded the minds of mankind. My mind became exceedingly distressed, for I became convicted of my sins. And by searching the Scriptures, I found that mankind did not come unto the Lord, but that they had apostatized from the true and living faith. And there was no society or denomination that built upon the gospel of Jesus Christ, as recorded in the New Testament. And I felt to mourn for my own sins and the sins of the world. See, so it was a dual quandary that occupied his mind when he decided to go into the woods that day. Bushman writes this: With no hope of privacy in the little cabin filled with children and household activity, he went to a place in the woods where he had left an axe in a stump in a clearing. And now listen carefully to this. In the minds of Mormons today, the events of that morning marked the beginning of the restoration of the gospel and the commencement of a new dispensation. The vision is called the first vision because it began a series of revelations. But at the time, Joseph did not know this was the first vision. Like anyone else, he understood the experience in terms of the familiar. In other words, for Joseph, this was just an answer to his prayer concerning his own spiritual worthiness, or sinfulness, if you will, and which church he should join to cleanse himself of that sin. Bushman continues, by 1832, when he recorded the vision, Joseph knew that his experience was one step in the rise of the church in the eve of time, along with Moroni's visits, the restoration of the Aaronic priesthood, and the reception of the high priesthood. But 12 years after the event, the first vision's personal significance for him still overshadowed its place in the divine plan for restoring the church. He explained the vision as he must have first understood it, as a personal conversation. In the 1832 account, he remembered that a pillar of light above the brightness of the sun at noonday came down from heaven above and rested upon me, and I saw the Lord, and he spake unto me, saying, Joseph, my son, thy sins are forgiven thee. Go thy way, walk in my statute, and keep my commandments. It was this message of forgiveness and redemption that he wanted to hear. A glancing reference to that vision in an 1830 revelation called it a time when, quote, Joseph received a remission of his sins, and he wrote, my soul was filled with love, and for many days I could rejoice with great joy, and the Lord was with me. It makes sense when you think about it. The answer about the church was just an adjunct for Joseph to his real worry about his own worthiness, and to him the vision made sense. Thy sins are forgiven thee. You do not need to join any of the churches because they're all an abomination to me. That next day in 1820, we don't know if young Joseph had any idea yet that he was going to build a restored church someday. Now I say that, but we also must remember that he said in the 1838 account that he was told many other things which he was not allowed to write or relay. So maybe he did. But in any event, this was to be a ways down the road. It still would be 3 years before he received Moroni's visits, and then 4 more years before he got possession of the plates, and then 3 more years before he had translated the Book of Mormon and had it published. So there was a lot to do before he built any new church. Bushman also says that Joseph was reluctant to talk about his vision. He says most of the early converts probably never heard about the 1820 vision. Joseph always considered it a personal vision, not like the revelation concerning the Book of Mormon plates, which were definitely meant for general distribution and considered the cornerstone of this new church he was building. But even with that, Joseph was reluctant to speak much of Moroni's visit as well, until explicitly commanded to speak to his father about it. Even as late as 1831, that's a year after the church was formed, he was slow to say much about Moroni. Bushman says Joseph was really not interested in notoriety. The one thing Joseph did do after that first vision was turn to a trusted Methodist minister he knew, thinking he would understand. This made perfect sense to him. It was common for newly converted people to talk about their experience with the clergy, and so it was a great shock to Joseph when his story was met with such contempt. He writes, some few days after I had this vision, I happened to be in the company of one of the Methodist ministers who was very active in the before-mentioned religious excitement, and conversing with him on the subject of religion, I took occasion to give him an account of the vision which I had had. I was greatly surprised at his behavior. He treated my communication not only lightly, but with great contempt, saying it was all of the devil, that there were no such things as visions or revelations in these days, that all such things had ceased with the apostles, and that there never would be any more of them. Now that reminds me of the Lord saying to Joseph that they have a form of godliness, teaching for doctrines the precepts of men, but denying the power thereof. And right here we have a perfect example of that. This was disappointing enough for young Joseph, but things got much worse very quickly. Had the conversation between the two men remained just with them, that would have been fine, and that's kind of what you expect with a preacher. But it didn't. He relates the ensuing events. I soon found, however, that my telling the story had excited a great deal of prejudice against me among the professors of religion, and was the cause of great persecution, which continued to increase. What an odd reaction this was. Remember, this was a time of great religious activity, and proclamations of spiritual gifts were abounding among all the people. Though there's no specific mention made of it, I'm sure that there were a great many displays of speaking in tongues, which was very popular in those days, and other spiritual gifts that generally accompany such revivals. For a young boy to say he saw God should have aroused perhaps only mild reaction, as all adults know that kids can be particularly impressionable and do have a tendency to make things up, or at very least interpret things differently than, wise old adults. But this was far more than idle amusement or curiosity on the part of the minister. He was genuinely offended, and he made his offense known among the other preachers in the area. Joseph was, of course, surprised by the furor. He wrote, "And though I was an obscure boy, only between 14 and 15 years of age, and my circumstances in life such as to make a boy of no consequence in the world, yet men of high standing would take notice sufficient to excite the public mind against me, and create a bitter persecution. And this was common among all the sects, all united to persecute me." I can understand Joseph's confusion. He had heard the preachers, and he had turned to the Scriptures for comfort and guidance, and he had followed the admonition of James. It made perfect sense to him to go tell the preacher he was most comfortable with about this experience. There's no record of exactly what Joseph said to the minister, but I'll bet it was the part about none of the churches being right and that all of them were an abomination to God that raised the hackles of the minister. If that were the case, I can see how the minister would have been offended, and since Joseph's account included all the churches, this might have been a topic of conversation among all the ministers, being grouped into one condemnation. As I think about it, perhaps telling a minister that God told you they were all wrong wasn't the wisest thing to do. But then again, sometimes young people are not quite as discreet as they perhaps should be. Joseph can be forgiven for this. To him, and to anybody really, this was an extraordinary event, and I'm sure the impact of it was foremost in his mind. Later, Joseph reflected on this, so we read in his history this: "It caused me serious reflection then, and often has since, how very strange it was for an obscure boy of a little over 14 years of age, and one, too, who was doomed to the necessity of obtaining a scanty maintenance by his daily labor, should be thought of as a character of sufficient importance to attract the attention of the great ones of the most popular sects of the day, and in a manner to create in them a spirit of the most bitter persecution and reviling. But, strange or not, so it was, and it was often the cause of great sorrow to myself." Joseph was a strong young man of solid character, and in the face of persecution that might have caused a weaker person to retreat and hide. But he only mustered up his resolve and moved forward, confident in what he had seen and heard. He would not be stopped, now or ever, even if it ultimately cost him his life, which it did. He declared, "However, it was nevertheless a fact that I had beheld a vision. I have thought since that I felt much like Paul when he made his defense before King Agrippa, and related the account of the vision he had when he saw the light and heard the voice. But still there were but few who believed him. Some said he was dishonest. Others said he was mad. And he was ridiculed and reviled. But all of this did not destroy the reality of his vision. He had seen a vision. He knew he had, and all the persecution under heaven could not make it otherwise. And though they should persecute him unto death, yet he knew, and would know to his latest breath, that he had both seen a light and heard a voice speaking unto him, and all the world could not make him think or believe otherwise. So it was with me. I had actually seen a light, and in the midst of that light I saw two personages, and they did in reality speak to me. And though I was hated and persecuted for saying that I had seen a vision, yet it was true. And while they were persecuting me, reviling me, and speaking all manner of evil against me falsely for saying so, I was led to say in my heart, Why persecutest me for telling the truth? I have actually seen a vision, and who am I that I can withstand God? Or why does the world think to make me deny what I've actually seen? For I had seen a vision. I knew it, I could not deny it, neither dared I do it. At least I knew that by so doing I would offend God and come under condemnation. I'm impressed by the strength of character this young man displayed in the face of such constant and vile persecution. But perhaps the stubbornness of his youth was the advantage for him. He had nothing to lose, no wealth to put in jeopardy, no social standing to protect. He was, in all senses, inconsequential. He was, as the Lord would say, among the weak and simple, and would proclaim unto the ends of the world and before kings and rulers. And so, as he ends this part of his history, he bears testimony to this. Let me read it here. I had now got my mind satisfied as far as the sectarian world was concerned, that it was not my duty to join with any of them, but to continue as I was until further directed. I had found the testimony of James to be true, that a man who lacked wisdom might ask of God, and obtain, and not be upbraided. Thus satisfied, Joseph now had to wait. He did not know for how long, for further light and knowledge from the Father and the Son. I can only imagine what those ensuing years must have felt like. If he was, in fact, the subject of persecution and reviling, those next 3 years must have been very difficult for the young boy and for his family. We don't really get much of his history between 1820 and 1823, but we do get this from Richard Bushman. He claims that the minister to whom Joseph related his tale reacted negatively, not due to the strangeness of his tale, but rather because of something else surprising. He says this: The preacher reacted quickly and negatively, not because of the strangeness of Joseph's tale, but because of its familiarity. Subjects of revivals all too often claimed to have seen visions. In 1826, a preacher at the Palmyra Academy said he saw Christ descend in the brightness exceeding tenfold the brilliancy of the meridian sun. And the Wayne Sentinel in 1823 reported Asa Wilde's vision of Christ in Amsterdam, New York, telling him that all denominations were corrupt. At various other times and places, beginning in the Protestant era, religious eccentrics had claimed visits from divinity. Norris Stearns published an account in 1815 of two beings who appeared to him. One was God, my Maker, almost in bodily shape as a man. His face was as it were a flame of fire, and his body as it were a pillar and a cloud. Below him stood Jesus Christ, my Redeemer, in perfect shape like a man. The clergy of mainline churches automatically suspected any visionary report, whatever its content. No person is warranted from the Word of God, a writer for the Connecticut Evangelical Magazine said in 1805, to publish to the world the discoveries of heaven or hell which he supposes he has had in a dream or trance or vision. Were anything of this kind to be made known to men, we may be assured it would have been done by the apostles when they were penning the gospel history. And then Bushman makes this point. Joseph's report of God's rejection of all creeds and churches would have sounded all too familiar to the Methodist evangelical who repeated the conventional point that all such things have ceased with the apostles and there never would be any more of them. This is all fine and good, but then why was Joseph, a young boy, picked out and subjected to the vilest kind of persecution and revulsion when others were not? It sounds like the other reports of heavenly visits were dismissed out of hand and nothing more would come of it. Why then Joseph? What was so special about his report? It could very well be that the other reports, and more like them, were actual visions of heaven and of the Lord. Perhaps others were approached by the Lord to do a work for him, but turned down the calling, the opportunity to be his servant, either for fear of the community or for other reasons. One notable report of a vision came from Hiram Edson, who, like Joseph Smith, was from the very same area as he. The year was 1844, soon after the martyrdom, and Hiram Edson, impressed by things he heard at a Millerite gathering, quote, was impressed to visit a dying neighbor and ask for his healing in the name of the Lord. He followed through on that thought, entering the neighbor's home late that night and laying his hands on him. It is said that the neighbor immediately threw off the blankets, got out of bed, and began praising God. Soon, the whole household was doing the same. That same night, he claimed to have had a vision in which the Lord told him to begin preaching the Advent message. Hiram Edson was one of the founders of the Seventh-day Adventist Church. But then again, not one of these people ever suffered the persecution that Joseph Smith was called to endure. It seems that Satan knew that this one lad was different, that he was going to be the one to establish the Lord's kingdom once again upon the earth. He was the target for Satan to direct all his efforts towards. There was no need to persecute the others, as they posed no real threat to him and his earthly dominion. Regardless of the forces at work to stop him, Joseph was resolute to do as the Lord had said, and so he waited, suffering in patience. There was much to do to keep the family alive, and the 60 acres that they had secured was work enough for all of them. According to Joseph Smith, he wrote, as it required the exertions of all that were able to render any assistance for the support of the family. We were deprived of the benefit of education. Suffice it to say, I was merely instructed in reading, writing, and the ground rules of arithmetic, which constituted my whole literary acquirements. Life continued in hardship through the summer of 23, when things were set to change dramatically for Joseph Smith. But we'll talk about that next week as we talk about his visit with Moroni and finish his account in Joseph Smith history. So until then, have a great week and be well. I'm Mark Swint. Thank you for listening.